The man who delivered bread to your house last week? He's now holding a machete, and he thinks he's doing the right thing. It sounds impossible, absurd. But in Rwanda in 1994, that's exactly what happened. Teachers became executioners, neighbors slaughtered neighbors, not because they were evil, but because they were told it was normal, necessary, patriotic. Most people didn't resist, they obeyed. And that's not just history. In 1961, a quiet lab experiment revealed something chilling. A psychologist in a white coat asked volunteers to press a button. Each press supposedly sent electric shocks to a stranger in the next room. The stranger screamed, begged, cried in pain, but the man in the white coat simply said, "Please continue." And 65% of people did, all the way to the highest voltage, not because they hated the person, but because they trusted the system. They obeyed. Now comes the question no one wants to ask. Would you? Not in theory, in real life. In your job, your home, your country. When a boss, a rule, a voice with authority tells you to follow, even when it feels wrong, what do? Because this is how it starts. Not with violence, but with language, with labels, with silence, with the small decision to stay quiet, to play along, to keep your head down. This video isn't here to condemn you, it's here to wake you up. Because the line between normal and unthinkable is thinner than you think. And most people don't realize they've crossed it until it's far behind them. You're not as different from them as you think, but you can be if you stay awake. So how does it happen? How do ordinary people, teachers, cashiers, fathers, neighbors, cross that line without even realizing it? The answer isn't hatred, it's obedience. Blind, quiet, well-intentioned obedience. When people believe they're simply doing their job, following orders, being a good citizen, morality becomes someone else's responsibility. And when no one feels responsible, unspeakable things unfold in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in classrooms, and sometimes in killing fields. In the Milgram experiment, the shock machine wasn't real, but the obedience was. Volunteers showed visible distress. They sweat, trembled, bit their lips. Some even laughed nervously, but most still pressed the button. Why? Because a man in a lab coat said, "The experiment requires that you continue." That's all it took. A voice of authority, a uniform, a sterile environment that told them, this isn't on you. And that illusion of not being the one truly responsible made them go further than they ever imagined they could. The Stanford prison experiment was even darker. College students were asked to play guards and prisoners. Just a few days in, the guards, normal young men, began humiliating and abusing their prisoners. Not because they were forced to, not because they were evil, but because the role gave them permission. The system whispered, "This is who you are now." And they obeyed with chilling ease. What began as pretend became real. The masks fused to their faces. This is the danger, not that people are monsters, but that people become what the system rewards, what the uniform allows, what the silence excuses. And all it takes is a subtle shift, a boss saying, "It's just company policy." A government saying, "We're keeping you safe." A friend saying, "Don't make it a big deal." That's how morality dies, not in a blaze of violence, but in the soft, polite language of obedience. Because here's the hardest truth. In systems like these, you don't need to be the villain to cause harm. You just need to play your part. Most people in genocides weren't executioners. They were drivers. They were clerks. They kept the records clean, the roads clear, the trains running on time. They handed out forms. They made the system work by not questioning it. And that's what makes this so dangerous. Evil doesn't need your hate, just your participation. In Rwanda, the man who turned in his neighbor didn't wake up thinking, "Today I'll be part of a genocide." He likely told himself, "I'm protecting my family," or "It's what everyone's doing," or worst of all, "I don't have a choice." By the time the machete was in his hand, he wasn't seeing his neighbor, he was seeing a cockroach. That word, repeated enough times on the radio, had rewired his perception. Language, repetition, fear, that's all it took. And this isn't ancient history. It's not some far-off anomaly. You hear echoes of it today in how we talk about immigrants, political opponents, entire communities. They're ruining the country. They're not like us. They're dangerous. That language doesn't just express prejudice, it manufactures it. It prepares people to stop seeing others as human. And the more we play along, laugh at the joke, nod with the group, scroll past the post, the more we're playing a role in a system we think we're not part of. But roles can be broken, masks can slip. And that only happens when someone decides not to keep reading the script handed to them, not to say the next line, not to play along. And the only way to do that is to recognize when you're in the scene. Because by the time the violence starts, it's already too late. The real danger was what happened before the first blow. The quiet nods, the comfortable lies, the moments no one spoke up. Because before people act, they repeat. Before they strike, they justify. And that begins with language, not the loud kind, not slogans or hate speech shouting through megaphones. No, it starts quieter, subtle, familiar. It sounds like they don't respect our values. They don't belong here. They're a threat to our way of life. Words that don't sound dangerous until you realize they've been turning people into enemies for centuries. In Rwanda, Hutu radio didn't just call Tutsis cockroaches. It told stories where the enemy was planning something, where violence wasn't aggression, it was defense. Just like that, genocide became survival. It was the same in Serbia. Serb media painted Bosniaks as extremists, invaders, traitors. And after weeks of this steady drip of fear and framing, ordinary people started seeing danger everywhere. Once you believe someone is subhuman or out to get you, violence starts to feel logical, even righteous. This isn't just history. We see the same linguistic patterns on talk shows, social media, even memes, jokes about invaders at the border, posts that mock them as lazy, diseased, dangerous. It doesn't feel extreme because it's dressed in irony or nationalism or just common sense. But that's what makes it effective. The words become part of the air we breathe. And without realizing it, we start to see the world through that lens. We become a little more afraid, a little more certain, a little more obedient. Because obedience doesn't begin with orders. It begins with stories that frame the other as the problem, stories that say silence is safety, that going along is survival. And unless we recognize those stories, the way they sound, the way they spread, the way they shape what feels normal, we risk becoming the next chapter. Not because we're hateful, but because we're human. And humans follow stories, especially when they come with fear, belonging, and a clear enemy. The stories haven't stopped, they've just gotten smarter, more polished. Today, the language doesn't always scream enemy. It whispers policy. It says this is just how the system works. And most of us go along not because we're cruel, but because we're tired, because it's easier to comply than to question, because we're told it's not personal, it's professional, it's just the job. Think about it, a supervisor tells you to fire someone even if they did nothing wrong. A platform rewards posts that ridicule, dehumanize, or divide, and we keep scrolling, liking, sharing. Algorithms push outrage, coworkers stay silent. Echo chambers reward certainty, not truth. And somewhere in that web, a line gets crossed, not with a scream, but with a shrug. That's how obedience works now, quietly, casually, with a smile. I don't make the rules. It's above my pay grade. I was just following protocol. This isn't about blaming individuals. It's about noticing how systems shape behavior, how roles and routines can dull our moral vision. In Stanley Milgram's experiment, people obeyed even when they thought they were hurting someone, simply because a man in a lab coat told them to. In the Stanford prison experiment, ordinary students transformed into cruel guards, not because they were evil, but because the role gave them permission. And every time they obeyed, the next step became easier. That's what should haunt us, the ease. How quickly normal people can become part of something unthinkable and feel like they're doing the right thing, or feel nothing at all. We imagine we'd be different. We de-resist. But are we resisting now, or are we trusting the system? Going along to get along, obedience isn't always a dictator shouting. Sometimes it's a calendar reminder, a company policy, a feed full of outrage. And if we don't notice the pattern, if we don't stay awake, then we might not even see the moment when we cross a line we never meant to reach. But not everyone obeys. Not everyone stays asleep. In the middle of every system, every crisis, every slow descent into cruelty, there are people who choose differently. They're not louder, richer, or braver by nature. They're just awake. They feel the same pressure, hear the same commands, watch others go along, but something inside them pauses, questions, refuses. During the Holocaust, a German factory owner named Oskar Schindler saved over 1,000 Jews, not because it was easy, but because it was right. In Rwanda, a woman named Paulina refused to join the killing, even as her neighbors fell into it. She didn't run. She didn't raise a weapon. She stayed human even when it meant standing alone. And in Milgram's own study, some participants did stop. Some looked at the man in the lab coat and said, "No, this feels wrong." Their refusal wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it mattered. That's what resistance looks like. Not fireworks, but friction, a moment of discomfort, a question that interrupts the script, a breath before action. The truth is, you won't always know when you're being asked to obey something dangerous. It won't come with a warning sign. It will look like procedure, policy, patriotism. What matters isn't whether you feel like a good person, it's whether you notice the moment when obedience asks you to stop being one. Staying morally awake is work. It means reflecting, asking hard questions, noticing when language dehumanizes, when authority silences, when roles blind us. It means being the person who says, "Wait, why are we doing this?" Even if your voice shakes, even if no one else does, obedience is effortless. It's the gravity of systems. But resistance is effort. It's choice. It's the daily decision to see clearly and to stay human. Not because you're better, but because you're awake. Maybe you're still thinking, but I would never. And maybe that's true, maybe you never would, but that's not what history is asking. It's not asking if you're a good person in theory. It's asking who you obey without thinking, who you trust without question, what you follow just to avoid discomfort. Because the people in Milgram's experiment didn't wake up evil. Neither did the neighbors in Rwanda or the guards in the Stanford basement. They were ordinary, just like us. What changed wasn't their hearts, it was their context. That's the unsettling truth. Genocide doesn't begin with monsters. It begins with quiet, with normal, with people who never meant to hurt anyone but also never stopped to ask where the road was going. That's the danger, not hatred but sleep. Systems that don't need your passion, just your passivity, just your silence. So if this made you uncomfortable, good. That's the beginning, because the goal of this video isn't to make you paranoid, it's to make you present. To remind you that obedience is easier than we think and resistance is harder than we hope. But resistance starts with awareness, with that small voice inside that says, this feels off. And instead of pushing it down, you listen, you pause, you ask. That's where history bends, not in sweeping revolutions, but in quiet refusals. You don't have to be perfect, you don't have to be fearless, but you do have to stay awake. Because the next time someone in power says, just follow orders, or everyone else is doing it, the world won't need you to be a hero, it will need you to notice, to question, to choose, and maybe, just maybe, to say no.